Hey listeners, this is Peter, and welcome back to the History Shorts. Today's episode is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the world. Download Podcast Republic today, available on Google Play and the Apple App Store. Today on History Shorts. Following this day in history, we will move on to talking about the biblical monsters. When most people picture dragons, monsters, or sea serpents in ancient stories, they think of Greek mythology, medieval times, or modern fantasy novels, not the Bible. But the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian Old Testament are filled with creatures that are strange, terrifying, and sometimes barely understood by modern readers. Multi-headed sea dragons, cosmic serpents of chaos, land beasts too large for the world, and fire-breathing monsters described in detail vivid enough to seem almost zoological. Their names still echo in theology: Leviathan, Behemoth, Rahab, and the Serpent of Eden, the great sea monsters, and the dragon of the book of Revelation. They appear in Psalms, prophecies, wisdom literature, and apocalyptic visions, sometimes as symbols, sometimes as metaphors, and sometimes as beings described as if they were truly alive. We will finish today's episode with our history brief from the conversation series Vault. We get to hear from one of America's greatest historians of all time, Professor James McPherson. A quick word from our sponsors. This day in history. On December 31st, 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to the East India Company, setting in motion one of the most powerful and controversial corporations in world history. What began as a group of London merchants seeking spice profits grew into a global empire within an empire, shaping trade, diplomacy, eventually colonial rule across the Indian subcontinent. On December 31st, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, bringing an end to a superpower that had dominated global politics for nearly 70 years. Overnight, 15 independent republics emerged. The Cold War came to an unmistakable close, and the geopolitical map of the late 20th century was rewritten. Story of the day. Our story today starts before the Bible itself, in the ancient Near East where Hebrew culture emerged. Egypt, Babylon, Canaan, and Mesopotamia all had myths in which gods battled some form of sea serpents or chaos monsters to bring order to the world. The Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, tells of the storm god Marduk killing the sea dragon Tiamat and forming the world from her body. In Canaanite religion, the storm god Baal defeats the sea monster Yem and the serpent Lotan, a name linguistically identical to Leviathan in Hebrew. The biblical authors were not copying these myths, but they were writing a world where monsters symbolized chaos, empire, and the forces opposed to divine rule. When the Hebrew Bible speaks of a sea monster, or dragons, or Rahab, or the serpent, the audience knew immediately. These were not just animals. These were symbols of cosmic disorder, the wilderness outside of creation, or the empires that oppressed the people of Israel. The first monster in the Bible appears in Genesis 1:21, during the creation of the world. And God created the great sea monsters. In Hebrew, the word is sometimes translated as sea creatures or whales in modern Bibles. But in ancient Hebrew, it meant dragon, serpent, or monstrous being of the deep. In the very first chapter of Scripture, the message is clear. God does not just create peaceful animals. He subdues and names the creatures ancient people feared most. If Genesis was the quiet introduction, then the book of Job is the full display. Near the end of Job, when the suffering protagonist demands answers from God, the reply comes not in comfort, but in a tour of the universe, including its most terrifying creatures. God challenges Job. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook? His sneezes flash forth light. Out of his mouth go flaming torches. He makes the deep boil like a pot. Some scholars read this as poetic metaphor. Others note that the description is anatomical. Scales, joints, muscles, and a tail that, and I quote, moves like a cedar tree. The creature is not just frightening, it is unconquerable. And the rhetorical point is that if Job cannot handle the most fearsome creature of creation, how can he judge the creator? The companion beast, Behemoth, appears just before Leviathan, a land creature so large that, and I quote, the mountains yield food for him, with bones like bars of bronze and a tail like a cedar. Some argue Behemoth is a hippopotamus, others a symbolic super beast. But Job's original audience would have heard something deeper. These creatures are not evil, but they exist beyond human power. They are gods, not ours. Another biblical monster, less known but deeply symbolic, is Rahab, not the woman of Jericho, but a sea dragon who appears in Psalms, Isaiah, and Job. In Psalm 89, God is praised for crushing Rahab like a carcass. In Isaiah, Rahab is paired with the dragon and the sea as symbols of God's enemies. To later readers, Rahab seems like a mythic beast, but to ancient Jews, it was a coded reference. Rahab was Egypt. The monster represented an empire, as Babylon later became shorthand for oppression in Christian writing. To speak of God conquering Rahab was not to talk about zoology at all. It was to talk about history through mythic language. God destroying Egypt at the Red Sea, just as Marduk destroyed Tiamat. To understand biblical monsters is to thus understand the ancient people that lived in a world where politics, nature, and myth were not separate categories. A dragon could be a literal sea creature, a symbol of empire, a force of chaos, or just an enemy of God. Sometimes it was all of them at once. Perhaps the most famous biblical creature is the serpent of Genesis, not called Satan in the text, not described with wings or horns, but simply, and I quote, more cunning than any beast of the field. Over time, Jewish and Christian interpretation merged the serpent with the cosmic dragon figures of older myth and the symbolic monster of later apocalyptic writing. By the time of the book of Revelation, the serpent is fully transformed into the great dragon, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan. This is a pattern of biblical monster evolution. Creatures that began as natural animals or mythic symbols became increasingly moralized over time. The serpent becomes Satan, Rahab becomes Egypt, Leviathan becomes the devil in medieval art. The monster does not change, but the meaning surely does. The most dramatic biblical monsters appear in apocalyptic texts. Daniel in the Old Testament, Revelation in the New. These are not biblical creatures, but political icons. The four beasts of Daniel represent the four imperial powers that ruled Israel: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. The seven-headed dragon of Revelation 12 is a fusion of Babylonian serpent lore, Roman imperial imagery, and Jewish Messiah's hope. Revelation describes the monster as a cosmic power that sweeps a third of the stars from the sky. It is later identified as the persecuting Roman Empire, but it is written in a myth-beast language, because apocalyptic writing uses monsters the way that political cartoons use caricature, to say what cannot be said plainly. After all, you wouldn't accuse the Roman Empire. Modern readers often expect ancient texts to choose between literal and symbolic. Ancient writers did not. To them, something could be both. The sea monster was real in the deep, and real in myth, and real as a symbol, which is why biblical creatures lived on. As Christianity spread into Europe, biblical monsters were merged with pagan ones. Behemoth became the beast of gluttony in Dante's Inferno. Leviathan became the embodiment of hell in medieval sermons and illuminated manuscripts. Dragons became the universal symbol of Satan, tempting saints and devouring sinners. St. George, a figure with no dragon in his earliest stories, acquires one in the Middle Ages because, well, monsters had become moral allegory. The ancient world used monsters to symbolize chaos. The medieval world used them to symbolize sin. This is why Leviathan, once a poetic personification of the sea, became, in Thomas Aquinas, the demon of envy. That is why Job's behemoth became, in later theology, the embodiment of the sin of gluttony. The monsters were not erased, they were simply reassigned. To medieval scholars, the Bible did not describe extinct animals at all. It described the supernatural architecture of good and evil, symbolism, more than anything else. Today, scholars argue about what, if anything, these monsters corresponded to in the natural world. Some claim Leviathan could be a crocodile, a whale, or a now extinct marine reptile. Others argue that the text was always poetry, not zoology. Still, others suggest that ancient oral memory may preserve garbled recollections of real prehistoric megafauna, just as global flood myths may encode memories of post-Ice Age sea rise. But whether or not a creature ever lived is separate from what that creature meant. The History Brief. From the History Shorts Conversation Series Vault, here is Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and one of the greatest historians in American history, Professor James McPherson. If you want to hear this entire episode, you could search this episode wherever you're listening to this podcast. How do you think the field of history has evolved over the years?
Yes, it's changed significantly. My career as a historian started in the 1960s, and so that's 60 years ago or more. It's changed a lot in that time. The traditional focus of history writing had been on political and military and to some degree economic events. And of course, these events were dominated not only in the United States but in the West in general and in Europe by men and by elites. And so history traditionally was a story of prime ministers, of presidents, of generals, of economic titans that left out 80 to 90% of the people. Were not elites, but they had their own history. And in the 1960s, historians began discovering that minorities, the working class, women, even children, had a history too. And so social history and cultural history, broadly defined in both cases, began to be important branches of history, and in some respects took over the center of historical research and scholarship and writing in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, to the point where at one point by the 1990s, the profession was talking about putting politics back into history because social history seemed to have almost taken it over. And so my own work, I think, has bridged, or I've tried to bridge both what we might call the old history and the newer history, the old history being political and military primarily, and the new history, social and cultural. In most of my works, I've tried to integrate, and I think the best historical writers have tried to integrate various aspects of history into a broader narrative that enables the reader to try to understand what's going on at several levels over time.
Thank you so much for spending some time with me today and helping me make this little show a mighty success. Keep on spreading the word. If you want to leave a comment or shoot me an email, you could do so at peter@historyshortspodcast.com. You could also visit www.historyshortspodcast.com or look for History Shorts Podcast on X, Facebook, and Patreon. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you all tomorrow.